Welcome back to Hoosier History, Legends, and Heroes. Welcome back to Ernie Pyle, Part 3. If you haven't watched Parts 1 and 2 of Ernie Pyle, I suggest that you take the time to give those a watch before watching this video. For a short review of Part 2, which started in March of 1941, Ernie had returned to the United States from several months in England after the death of his mother. Ernie's first book, Ernie Pyle in England, is published. Ernie and Jerry would divorce with the blessing of her doctors, nurse, and her family, hoping that this will help her to become stronger and that her mental health would improve. December 7th of 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and on December the 8th, America is officially at war. Ernie decides to go back overseas, first in Ireland, and then England, and then Northern Africa. On March 12, 1943, he finds out that he and Jerry were remarried by proxy on March the 10th. The Allies have pushed the Germans out of North Africa by May of 1943. Ernie says that he will be heading to Algeria for a bath, to do laundry, and get caught up on letters and his column. And what comes after that is anybody's guess. When Ernie returns to Algeria, he finds it full of British and American soldiers. Jeeps and staff cars were having to navigate between camels and horse-drawn vehicles. Ernie found that he couldn't handle civilization after his time at the front. He would find a small army camp outside of the city where he and a few correspondent friends of his would pitch tents. During the months of being with the soldiers at the front, he wasn't getting his mail. Now that he is back in Algeria, his mail catches up to him. And it's not just mail from family and friends. He received letters from his readers, generals' wives, aircraft workers, school kids, old schoolmates, and mothers and fathers. They wrote to him about everything, even telling him what they were having for supper. He was given remedies for sore hands and drawings of improvised stoves for tents. Many wrote telling him that they were sending him cigarettes, soap, shaving lotion, books, cookies, and sweaters. He would write that none of these items made it to him, but the fact that they were sent was enough. Other letters would ask for him to try to find their family members. He would receive the letters of those who had lost their loved ones, asking him if he could find out more details of what actually happened. He would write, "How I wish that it were possible. Those are the letters I would give anything to comply with. Those of you who have lost close ones seem to write so beautifully, so resignedly, and so patiently, that it is doubly hard on me to be forced to do nothing about your letters." He received so many of these letters that it was just impossible for him to be able to act on them. He would also write, "This column is addressed to all of you readers who have written me, and even to a large percentage of my personal friends back home, to tell you why I can't answer your letters individually, and yet to thank you from the bottom of my heart for you writing them." While Ernie is writing his columns from the battlefront, he unknowingly becomes America's #1 war correspondent. Newspapers back home can't sing Ernie's praises enough. They love his columns. Once again, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, talks about Ernie's column. She writes, "The column which to me stands out as the most human and vivid story of the men in the African theater is Ernie Pyle. I would not miss that column if I possibly could help it, and I am sure that many people feel just as I do." Ernie's popularity back home leads to his second book, titled Here Is Your War. The book is the collection of Ernie's writings about the fighting in Northern Africa. The book was sold at a price of $3. And if you remember, in Ernie Part 2, his first book, Ernie Pyle in England sold for 50 cents. He was making more money in the year of 1943 than he ever had. He would write to his dad and Aunt Mary that at times it feels wrong to be making big money during the war when so many were dying and getting nothing. But he would also write that he wasn't profiteering and he's earning it the hard way, being at the front with the soldiers where he is far from safe, and he did feel that he was contributing some good through his columns. I'm sure the families back home absolutely agreed that his columns were worth more to them than he knew. After Tunisia, and following his month with the infantry, Ernie mentions to his friend and boss, Lee Miller, that maybe, if the Navy was interested, they could find something for him to do. And did they ever! The invasion of Sicily, also called Operation Husky, would be happening soon. Planned were 2,000 British and American ships, destroyers and transports, minesweepers and mine layers, subchasers and self-propelled barges. It was to be the largest seaborne assault ever undertaken at that time. A few days before the invasion, Ernie was secretly taken away from Algeria and would board the flagship, the USS Biscayne. After the hardships of northern Africa, he would find on board ship that it was a completely different world. He had access to ice cream, soft drinks, the current magazines, even after-dinner movies, showers, beds with mattresses, and when you ate, you actually got to sit at a table with silverware. Below decks, it was hot and uncomfortable, so the ship's captain had a cot with a mattress set up on the deck for him, where it was more comfortable to sleep. And for this kindness, Ernie would edit the ship's daily newspaper. At this time, the Biscayne hasn't seen any fighting. The crew was a little nervous about getting ready to head into battle. Well, one very early morning, while Ernie was doing his editing, German planes attacked Bizerte, Tunisia, where the ship was anchored. The attack lasted about an hour and a half. I'm sure it was crazy for everybody in the area. Only 3 men of the Biscayne were injured, and the ship's guns shot down a German plane. After this, the crew now knows that they are up to the task. Late one afternoon, the Biscayne would raise anchor and join the invading fleet. The Allied armies had 2 landing locations. The Americans under General George S. Patton would land around Jala, and the British under Sir Bernard Montgomery would land around Syracuse. Ernie writes about an exciting yet terrifying experience for everyone aboard the Biscayne. He writes that as after every member of the present crew has been transferred away, he's sure the story of the searchlights will linger on in the wardroom and be written in legend. He continues, "It is the story of a few minutes when the fate of this ship hung upon the whim of the enemy. For some reason which we will probably never know, the command to obliterate us was never given." Ernie would explain, after the long invasion voyage from North Africa, they had stopped at their designated place off the south coast of Sicily. He would say that the ship was about 3.5 miles from shore. They'd stopped only a minute when big searchlights blinked on from the shore and began to search the waters. After several sweeps, one of them centered dead upon them and stopped. Then, as they held their breaths, the searchlights, one by one, came down with their beams upon their ship. They had found their mark. They had been discovered, and they were caught in a funnel from which there was no escape. The commanding officer decided to sit as quiet as a mouse, and all of them just waited in terror. There were 5 lights that were shining on the ship, and after what seemed like hours, the lights started going out, one by one, and not a shot had been fired. A summer storm had hit, which almost caused the cancellation of the invasion on the scheduled date. The storm made things difficult for the paratroopers that were dropped behind enemy lines. But the storm also worked to the Allies' advantage because the Axis defenders pretty much figured nobody in their right minds were going to try to do an invasion in this weather. And boy, were they wrong. By the afternoon of July 10th, thousands of Allied troops made it to the Sicilian shore, bringing with them 600 tanks. The Allied Navy and planes were bombing the Axis positions. Aboard the Biscayne, Ernie was witnessing everything firsthand. Ernie was able to go ashore on the first day. He found a ride into town and watched the roundup of nervous Italian troops and civilians the American military did not trust. There wasn't much in the anti-invasion defenses, but counterattacks were beginning. After the third day, there were few enemy planes ever spotted. Ernie was busy writing his column, but this time from a naval point of view. One time Ernie went ashore and ran into other war correspondents, and he would write to his friend and boss, Lee Miller, that he got his picture taken with the big general, meaning he got his picture taken with General George Patton. Ernie would write, "Since Sicily was a new country, he might as well get sick right away and get it over with." So, on his fifth day ashore, they threw him into an ambulance and went hunting for a hospital. The ambulance drivers drove almost halfway across Sicily trying to find the field hospital, then gave up and headed back, traveling what he would say were 75 agonizing miles over dusty gravel roads. They would find the hospital set up and ready for business just 4 miles from where they had started in the first place. He was tested for dysentery. Tests were negative. They brought in a couple of Italian malaria experts, and nope, that wasn't it either. He ended up having what was called battlefield fever. Ernie would spend less than a week in the hospital. Afterwards, he would spend 3 days with General Omar Bradley while the American soldiers were battling the Germans. One day he walked 4 miles with a group of combat engineers, and half of the next day all he could do was lay down. Everything was catching up to him. Physically and mentally, he was exhausted. During his time in Sicily, Ernie had run into a fellow Scripps Howard columnist, Raymond Clapper. Clapper would write to Ernie's friend and boss, Lee Miller, telling him that Ernie really needed to come home. He looked completely worn out. Lee would send a message urging him to take a vacation and come home. After the fall of Sicily, and before receiving Lee's message, Ernie had made the decision to go home. He would catch a clipper home from French Morocco. Ernie would arrive at LaGuardia Field on September 7, 1943, and was met by Lee Miller. The duo would go to the Algonquin Hotel, where Ernie would try to phone Jerry at their home, but he was not able to get through. A few hours later, and after almost no sleep, the phone started ringing. Ernie had no idea of how popular and famous he had become. Newspapers and magazines wanted interviews, radio people wanted Ernie on their broadcasts, and Army intelligence needed to question him. Now, this was something which was routine for correspondents returning back to the States. He was bombarded by interviewers and photographers. The phone didn't stop ringing. Ernie and Lee would escape New York by taking a train to D.C., where they found life even more hectic than in New York City. Even Hollywood came knocking on Ernie's door. The War Department was wanting a movie to be made about the infantry, and Hollywood producer Lester Cohen just knew that Ernie's new book was exactly what they were looking for. Ernie would meet with Cohen, and Cohen would get the rights to make the movie. Ernie escapes and heads to Dana for a few days and then home to Jerry. he finds that they can still see 80 miles outside of their front door, and the sunsets were still spellbinding. Sadly, he finds Jerry is still medically frail. Her caregivers say that she is doing really well at her job, but she just can't handle any emotional tension. They also believe another nervous collapse is in her future. Operation Husky had ended on August 17th. Ernie is back in America on September 7th. And American forces landed at Salerno, Italy on September the 9th, 1943. Ernie knows that he must return to the troops in Italy. Before leaving, Jerry had a breakdown and had to be hospitalized for a few days, but would be back home with Ernie before he left. Jerry had found a wool-lined sleeping bag that she had given him as a going-away gift before he left. He did stop in Clinton, Indiana, to visit his father, who was in the hospital. I read that one reason was a hip injury, and another source I read said it was Bright's disease. So I'm really not sure what was wrong with his dad, but I do know that he was in the hospital. He returned to Washington and had many things to do, and one afternoon he found himself having tea with the First Lady after he had sent her a thank you note for her praising of his new book. There were conferences about the movie. He had inoculations to get. His leaving the U.S. ended up being delayed, so he started writing his column again. He would write, "I've never hated to do anything as badly in my life as I hate to go back to the front. I dread it, and I'm afraid of it. But what can a guy do? I know millions of others who are reluctant to, and they can't even go home. So here we go. The decision, it's true, is my own. Nobody is forcing me to go back. Probably that's the reason I feel so glum about it. Going back is all my own fault. I could kick myself." In late November of 1943, Ernie left the United States to begin the next chapter in his life. Thanks for watching Part 3 of Indiana-born Ernie Pyle. I hope you enjoyed learning more about his time with the military during Operation Husky. His close call along with all of the sailors on the USS Biscayne when they were found by the enemy searchlights and not a shot was fired. And also his meetings with General Patton and General Bradley. Be sure to subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment. Be sure to click on the notification bell so that you will be notified when the next Choose Your History, Legends, and Heroes video is uploaded. Until next time,